Between the 15th and the 17th centuries, as many as 500,000 women were rounded up, tried, tortured, and executed by the state for the crime of witchcraft. But if you open any history of the labor movement, especially the global labor movement, they don't normally appear. Why is that? Welcome to Champagne Magazine. Welcome back to our read-through of Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. This book, and I keep saying it, it is absolutely incredible. We are on today chapter 4, which is all about the Great Witch Hunt in Europe. And that means we are tackling some things that we've been kind of building towards in the first 3 chapters. We've seen everything from Silvia Federici's kind of history in the first 2 chapters, where she lays out a lot of the stuff that's going to happen in this chapter, as well as Silvia Federici's more, let's call it academic look at magic, the magical body, the rise of kind of the mechanism, and she's going to talk more about this in this chapter as well. I will say about this chapter that there is not much new argument here. A lot of the arguments that you will see raised in this chapter are things that we've talked about before, especially in those first 2 chapters, but we're going to rehash a little bit of this, and of course, I'm not saying skip this chapter by any means. There's so much new and interesting historical material in this chapter. It's just that this is the chapter, chapter 4, where Federici starts really sharpening her argument, and that gives us a lot to talk about here. Now, primarily in this chapter, Federici is making a very clear complaint about the way that we normally talk about the witch hunts. And the witch hunts, of course, they span centuries. We're mostly confining ourselves to the 15th to 17th century, as I laid out in the intro, but this goes on for actually quite a while. And Federici basically says, well, listen, we normally talk about these witch hunts as if they are superstitious nonsense and kind of the last vestige of a dying feudal system. But that ignores the fact, Federici says, that the witch hunts properly really started out at the end of the late medieval period. They weren't really present before. Of course, you had witchcraft. Of course, you had an understanding that magic was a thing. And much earlier on, you had many societies kind of cracking down on the effects of witchcraft. So if a witch cursed you and you could prove that, then you were entitled to some compensation. Witchcraft itself, being criminalized, doesn't really come around until this period, especially, and we'll talk about this, but in the 1500s. So we're going to talk about all of this. I have split this chapter into 4 main sections, and they are not of equal length, but we're going to be talking about engineering the Great Witch Hunt, sort of the legal background of this. Then we're going to talk about class war and the witch hunt, which is a very, very important piece of this, and I'm saving some of the colonization stuff for the next chapter. That's when we're going to get a little bit more into that, but of course, there's a huge component of this that is racially motivated as well. Federici alludes to this here, so we'll reference that. We'll talk more about that next time. Then we're going to talk very briefly about science and rationalism. This is something that Federici says is maybe a little bit overemphasized. We will get to that idea, though. And then we'll talk about the legacy of the witch hunt. And in the legacy section, I want to leave you with a couple questions that I think we can kind of talk through, just kind of in our modern times, because the witch hunt, and Federici has said this several times through this book, the witch hunt never really ended. All of these mechanisms carry on very much into the present day. But again, when we talk about the Great Witch Hunt, we are mostly confining ourselves to this period where the trials kind of begin in the 1440s. They reach a peak, this kind of frenzy in the 1550s, 1560s, and then they start to fade right around the year after the year 1700, although they still continue for a surprising amount of time. We have said this before, but the victims of the witch hunts are mostly peasants. They are mostly working class women, and it's one reason that the Marxist analysis of the proletariat skipping this kind of women, this kind of witch hunt analysis is so egregious. The main argument that Federici is sharpening in this chapter, I just want to lay this out here before we go into it, but the main argument that Federici is sharpening is that the persecution of witches was a state-sponsored campaign to break female autonomy in work, in sexuality, and in collective revolt. Federici says that the witch hunt of this period is laying the foundation for a new type of patriarchy and really a new type of control. And I should say, as always, before we start, if you want more of this and extra content, including the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series that I'm doing, you can check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. If you are already a subscriber there, thank you. I love you so much. You really help make this whole thing go. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. I'm just coming back from a couple weeks in the US, so I've been a little behind on checking my messages and checking the comments and everything. So I'm going to start catching up to all that and posting more on socials. So I will see you all there. But let's start off, and let's start with the engineering the witch hunt idea. Federici raises this question pretty early on, which is trying to understand some of the normal explanations for how the witch hunts happened. And she basically says, listen, it would be very, very nice to be able to get into the mindset of the people that were the witch hunters, the people that were going out to find women, to subjugate them, essentially. But we don't really need to know where they were coming from. It would be great information to have to just sort of pin down an answer once and for all. Why did this all happen in the first place? But we can look at the circumstances, and we can look at what happened after, and we can kind of come up with a very solid theoretical explanation for why all of this happened. And the reason that Federici comes to is not the idea that the church saw a new power base emerging after the heretic movements and so had to go and crush it. That doesn't really explain the timing, and it's not this idea of just rampant superstition, because it was quite top-down and directed. And so the explanation that Federici comes from is that main argument that I laid out at the beginning. This is about subjugation. This is about control. This is about subjugating the bodies of women in order to better control the proletariat. And you can see that because the witch hunts really start to kick off properly after 1532. And in 1532, what happens is Charles V, as close as Europe ever got to a one single emperor uniting all of Europe, Charles V issues his Carolina. And in Charles's Carolina, you have, for the first time ever, witchcraft becoming a capital crime. And then, of course, Charles is Catholic. You have Protestant countries like England following later. England follows with 3 major witchcraft acts, and they start in 1542, about 10 years after Charles issues the Carolina. What Federici also says is that as you're talking about engineering the witch hunt, as you're talking about laying down the foundations for what would become the subjugation of women, this is a perfect first example of the use of mass propaganda to create mass hysteria. We might think that that's kind of a modern example, right? You can see whatever it is, Elon Musk on Twitter stirring up mass discontent and feeding misinformation to anybody who follows him. Mass media is what we think of as a modern phenomenon. We don't think about mass media when we think about the Middle Ages, but actually, back then, they had a pretty new and pretty devastating technology that was, at this point, really taking hold of the continent. It's what allowed for the Protestant Reformation. And if you're following along in my other series on the Patreon channel, the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers, we just talked about Thomas Müntzer and the Protestant Reformation and Münzer's clash with a guy called Martin Luther, who is a tremendously influential guy. All of these upstart preachers are using this new technology, and that is, of course, the printing press. Now, we shouldn't overemphasize the power of the printing press because not a lot of Europe can read at this point, but it is a good way to disseminate information very, very quickly. And along with the printing press comes the hiring of multiple artists to create depictions of witches in their evil capabilities. And you also see an emerging class of new kind of thinker go out and start to talk about the dangers of witchcraft. This is a very early example of propaganda. And again, these states are also just starting to come into existence. This is the start of early capitalism, and so this is effectively the first time we see, from the perspective of the capitalist system, a propaganda push that props that up. There's plenty of examples in the modern day. But this is kind of where it all starts. So you have all these new printing presses flooding Europe with lurid pamphlets and demonology manuals, and both Catholic and Protestant writers are kind of united around this common ground, which is pretty wild. The other thing when we talk about engineering the witch hunts, sort of the legal underpinnings of all of this, is that, and Federici makes this point, but like high treason, which also comes around at the time, the charge of high treason, and like terrorism, which is a charge we use now, and when Federici was writing this back in 2004, terrorism is a very, very top-of-mind kind of charge. But the charge of witchcraft, high treason, terrorism, they are all very, very vague, and that vague distinction gives it tremendous power. So witchcraft, ultimately, it's an elastic distinction, right? It can easily cover things like crop failure. It can also cover infertility. It can cover politics. It can cover things like discontent. Witchcraft is an extremely powerful designation because it can fit almost anything you need it to fit. And that gives, of course, men power over women, but it also gives the state tremendous power over this emerging proletariat. Now, there is a dynamic that we'll talk about more when we talk about class war, but there's a dynamic of divide and conquer that we're seeing start to emerge here. So as power is being put into the hands of men, you're starting to see the emergence of this demonization of women and this argument that comes from the powerful that men should fear and seek to control women for their own masculinity, for their own manhood. And so this starts to develop, and that's where that comes from. Now, the last thing we should mention when we talk about the things that created the conditions for this great witch hunt that was about to come was the cultural argument. So there is a lot to this. One of the things that I just wanted to mention briefly is that you have this identification of women as simultaneously weak and powerful. They are powerful in the sense that they can access this magical power and are therefore dangerous and therefore must be controlled, but also that women as a feminine class are weak and subject to rule, especially rule by the devil. So the women are inviting the devil in, and there's a really interesting point that Federici makes in this chapter specifically when she talks about the popular portrayal of magicians. Up to this point, magicians were powerful entities, sorcerers, who could summon up the devil and command him to do their will, to do their bidding. He would do work and he would not be paid for this work. There would be a little bit of trickery that the magician would do to bend the devil himself to that magician's whims. When, however, the subject switches from the masculine magician to the feminine witch, all of a sudden the witch is being controlled by the devil. The witch is inviting the devil in. It becomes kind of what Federici calls a perverse marriage. This is a portrayal of femininity as both powerful because of its access to the devil and also weak. And it's just another argument in a slew of arguments that women must be controlled for the good of society. And by the way, before we leave this section, it is very easy to kind of laugh off the witch hunts and to think that this was because it was 500 years ago. But it's actually a little bit more than that, because this idea, this conception of us, which is very much rooted, by the way, in Enlightenment philosophy, this conception of women as having this kind of inherent moral weakness has not left us. As ridiculous as it sounds, this still very much permeates our society now. So Federici is absolutely right to raise this point and to point to this sort of cultural argument that starts to emerge at this time. It sounds contradictory, right? Power and weakness together, but it's not. It's not at all. In fact, it kind of serves to advance the whims of the powerful people in this situation, and we see echoes of that in the modern day. But let's leave engineering the witch hunt for now, and let's move to class war and the witch hunts, because that's really what this is. When I say class war, what I'm really talking about is class anxiety. So we said at the beginning, these witch hunts tended to target the impoverished, the elderly. These are women who often are down on their luck, and Federici makes this point that persecutions spike when elites worry that the poor might effectively, to get revenge, hire the devil. So the poor see their power disappearing, the elites see their power growing, and in that difference, the elites look at the poor and feel a real fear because they say, listen, this widow that has just been dispossessed of her property, she may curse me. And that at that point is a very real fear. And so you have to crack down on witchcraft. And it's a way for elites to kind of wage this class war. Federici also talks about this myth of the Sabbat. The Sabbat is a kind of nocturnal, thousands-strong gathering of witches, and it's this vile sexual orgy, and it becomes a little bit political in its own way and feeds into the idea of mass uprising. So the idea that witches are communing at night in this kind of intense political atmosphere at this Sabbat in sexual revelry is very, very dangerous, and that may strike fear into the hearts of the upper classes. But there's another component to this idea of class war, and that is, if you look across Europe at this time, remember, Europe is still kind of reeling from the effects of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which decimated Europe's population. They're looking out there, they're seeing declining fertility rates and the need to replace workers, and so all of a sudden, you see things emerge like the Papal Bull of 1484, which bundles witchcraft in with abortion and child murder. All of a sudden, witchcraft becomes identified with something that is, in their minds, uniquely sinful. So abortion is kind of one of the worst acts you could commit as a witch because you are removing somebody from the workforce. Now remember, this is a will to dominate, the means of reproduction. Federici has argued this earlier in this book where she has said, listen, this is an effort by the powerful to control the womb, to control not just the worker, but the production of workers. And so this is a way, the witchcraft, the witch hunts, to crack down on anything that smacks of abortion, infanticide, anything like that. And through this, women's bodies are cast as these things that are uniquely sinful, right? They are economically disruptive and they can withhold reproduction, which is a problem for the emerging bourgeoisie. And so you have what is effectively a re-rationalization of sexuality for capitalist ends. So instead of sex being kind of fun and for things beyond procreation, sex is all of a sudden just confined to procreation alone. If you're not having sex for procreation, typically it is outlawed. And you see the outlawing of everything from homosexuality to nudity, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. These are old things that used to happen kind of all the time. Federici alludes to the fact that homosexuality was fairly rampant in the Renaissance period, for example. And at this point, the church starts to really crack down on these practices because it needs the workers. And so you see the identification of women with abortion and with hideously deviant sexual practices, right? Bestiality is something that they try to link to witchcraft as well. And through all this, you also have a reimagining of kind of the problem of male supremacy, because if women have this kind of power, then it's a unique threat to men. And again, if it's a threat to men, then women must be controlled. So there's all sorts of folklore that starts to appear around this time of witches stealing male genitalia, for example. That kind of happens a lot, and that's just another symbol of the potential power that a witch has over the literal male body. It drives a wedge between men and women who are both oppressed within the context of the proletariat. This is something that the colonizer does as well. It's the same kind of dynamic. That's exactly what you're seeing here in this situation. And what's interesting about this period is that you see kind of diverging depictions of witchcraft as well. Federici raises this point as well, because you have the witch as the old widow who's just out there trying to survive. She's poor, and so she might put a curse on you, but you also have the young, beautiful, powerful, rebellious female spirit, and both of these women have to be controlled. That's basically the argument of witchcraft. And because it is such an ever-shifting, ever-moving definition, that gives men and the powerful in this point in time, the elites, a tremendous amount of say over what happens to the literal bodies of women. And as we think about this definition of witchcraft and the ways in which it moves, it's worth reading an account of an accused witch. This appears on 187 in the Penguin, and it's worth actually reading in full because it is very, very interesting and I think instructive about what exactly was happening at this point in time. This is a quote from Thomas that she's repurposed for this book, and the story goes, "She had picked a basket of peas in the neighbor's field without permission. Asked to return them, she flung them down in anger, since then no pears would grow in the field. Later, William Goodwin's servant denied her yeast, whereupon his brewing stand dried up. She was struck by a bailiff who had caught her taking wood from the master's ground. The bailiff went mad. A neighbor refused her a horse. All his horses died. Another paid her less for a pair of shoes than she asked. Later, he died. A gentleman told his servant to refuse her buttermilk, after which they were unable to make butter or cheese." And that's from Thomas in 1971. This is, in other words, a string of unlucky circumstances, but you can find a scapegoat. And that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about driving a wedge between people in the proletariat. When you can offer up a scapegoat to the men and prove that they are sort of superior, even as they're both members of an underclass, you have tremendous power over the proletariat that is growing. And if this sounds like it has echoes into our modern day, it's because it does. But before we go on to sort of science and rationalism, we should say a couple words about the New World. Again, not particularly new to the people who were living there, but it's understood at the time as the New World. This is colonizers coming in and using the same logic that they used to oppress Europe's women, the witches of Europe. They turn that same logic onto the colonies. And in the colonies, you're essentially seeing colonizers map this kind of evil magic that is taking off in Europe onto black skin in particular. You have things like the persecution of local healers, which looks a lot like the persecution of local healers back in Europe. That's exactly the same thing. You also, all across the colonies, have your own form of witch trials going on at the same time. And in some places in the Americas, they continue for a lot longer as well. That same sort of sexual demonization as well is also linked to this colonial logic and the colonial mentality. You have a depiction of black people, men and women, as kind of being possessed by this demonic sexual spirit. And that is seen as well as incredibly dangerous and something as well that must be controlled. Again, we're going to get a little bit more into the New World in the next chapter, so we'll talk more about that as it comes up, but this is an important part of this chapter now, so we should definitely reference it. Let's go on and briefly talk about science and rationalism. Now, Federici has made a big point about this, especially in chapter 3. We talked about this earlier, but the idea that rationalism is taking off and starting to supplant sort of traditional forms of knowledge, this kind of magical power that people felt like they had before. This is the new emerging rationalist, mechanist kind of thinking. This is very dangerous for these new kinds of thinking, and so it must be done away with. But Federici is very circumspect about this. She's pretty clear that this is not the primary driver of the demonization of women and the rise of these persecutions of witchcraft. This is a contributing factor, right? It's riding shotgun, but really what we're talking about here is the new forms of capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, which is starting to emerge. So this is not so much about science and rationalism, our new understandings, but it is, of course, part of the picture, and that's important too. She also mentions, and again, we can say the witch trials never truly ended, that is a helpful thing to say, but of course the Great Witch Trial of Europe did end. And it peters out, she says, after states feel secure. Now, this is something that she doesn't add a ton of evidence to. Everything else in this book is supported by quotes and citations and examples and all of this stuff. This is something that she, I think, doesn't do quite enough to support, but it is an argument that I think makes a lot of sense nonetheless. So as states begin to feel much more secure in where they are, in their position, in their power over the subjugated new proletariat, the witch trials start to become less and less important, and so they start to fade. This is around the 1700s, although of course they continue for quite a while. And that's mainly the argument that Federici is throwing out there. Now let's turn from that to the legacy of the witch hunts. And legacy-wise, This is a specter that still continues to haunt us. And I think when you're thinking about questions and when you're thinking about this chapter especially, you should think a lot about the cultural archetype that we have right now about the dangerous woman. We have any number of modern sex panics. We have any number of religious people and politicians coming out to demonize human sexuality and to reinforce this stereotype of women as kind of the morally weaker sex. This happens kind of a lot. It's worth kind of stepping back and saying, hey, where do we still see this logic permeate our daily lives? Because I would make the argument that it's there a lot. In many ways, we may have kind of internalized that to some degree ourselves, no matter how much leftist theory we have read. This is, of course, the patriarchy, but it's ingrained at an incredibly deep level. And it's one of those things, if I can talk just on a personal level here, that when I read a work like Caliban and the Witch, I approach this from a level of a little bit of humility because I know that I don't have the experience of growing up as a woman. I don't understand sort of the struggle of being a woman in the modern world. And of course, that struggle looks very different depending on who you are, depending on where you are, depending on what level of socioeconomic class you are at. All of that, none of that's going to be homogenous in any respect, but I think that there is something sort of qualitative that somebody like me reading this book will necessarily not be able to grasp. And somebody else reading this book may intuitively understand what exactly permeates our society now that is just beyond my reach. Anyway, I won't say too much more about that. Let me know what you think about all of this. Where do you think these campaigns that we see now against bodily autonomy come from? Do you think that Federici is right, that they are kind of rooted in this in this medieval logic, let's say? Do you think that this idea that I've thrown out there about this kind of understanding of women as users of witchcraft still permeates modern society? Do you think that we can actually say that? I think all of these are really, really interesting questions and things that we kind of must wrestle with as we walk away from a chapter like Chapter 4 of Caliban and the Witch. Now, I will be back next week and we're going to talk all about colonization and Christianization. Thank you, as always, for watching. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much again, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.